the untouchable heart of the hegemony. Deep within the titanium-laced sanctum of Central Command, Colonel Ivan Rostova watched the world through the eyes of a god. The global Iron Dome, his nation's 30-year masterpiece of layered defense, was a silent, perfect shield. Nothing hostile could breathe in their airspace for more than a few seconds before being vaporized by a curtain of plasma and steel. It was not a theory, it was a law of modern warfare. Then the heresy appeared. Not a missile launch, not a squadron of jets, but a single venomous flicker on the quantum grid. It was too high a ghost breathing in the void where the air was too thin for fire. It was too fast, a phantom moving at a velocity that should have torn any known airframe to shreds. The dome's automated systems screamed in digital confusion, unable to calculate a firing solution for a target that defied physics. Ice flooded Rostova's veins. A decorated ace who had claimed the sky as his birthright, he felt a primal dread he hadn't known since his first solo flight. He ordered a stratospheric satellite to zoom in his heart, pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. And there it was. Against the cold, crystalline blue, a single, impossibly thin contrail was being drawn with silent arrogance across their capital. It was a scar carved upon their invincibility. That silent line was not a warning. It was an obituary written across the heavens for an empire that did not yet realize it was already dead. The silent, damning evidence of the contrail burned on the main holoscreen in the war room, a pristine white scar across a perfect blue sky. Yet the reaction from the hegemony's high command was not the disciplined urgency Colonel Ivan Rostova had expected. It was a suffocating, contemptuous silence. His report, delivered with the clipped electronic precision of a man fighting to keep his voice from shaking, had landed in the center of the granite-floored chamber like a shard of glass in a bowl of milk. It was foreign, unwelcome, and fundamentally wrong. He stood alone before the Strategic Council, the after-image of that impossible aircraft seared into his mind. "My conclusion is unequivocal," Rostova repeated, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "We were overflown by an unknown trans-atmospheric vehicle. It penetrated the dome's primary sensor net at an altitude and velocity that exceed all known operational parameters. Our systems could not achieve a lock. It acted with complete impunity. General Maxim, a portly man whose uniform seemed perpetually a size too small, was the first to break the stillness. He waved a dismissive hand. "Solar flares," he grunted, not even bothering to look at the screen. "We've seen it before. High-energy particles can create ghost signals, fool the quantum sensors. It's a textbook anomaly." "Sir, with respect," Rostova countered, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his datapad. "This was no ghost. We have visual confirmation. A contrail. It held a deliberate, steady course directly over the capital." PSYOPs sneered another officer, Admiral Petrov from the Navy, his face a mask of condescending pity. "The enemy launches a suborbital rocket, releases a chemical trail in a pre-planned trajectory, and hopes our spotters get spooked. It's a cheap propaganda stunt." "You fell for it, Colonel." The room murmured with assent. It was an easy answer, a comfortable one. It required no re-evaluation, no uncomfortable questions. It preserved the sanctity of their faith. But Rostova would not let it go. A stunt that flew at Mach 7 at 2,000,000 feet. That evaded every intercept protocol we have. If this is their propaganda, then their propaganda is more advanced than our reality. The doors at the far end of the chamber hissed open, and the low-level chatter died instantly. Marshal Volkov entered, the supreme commander of the hegemony's armed forces. He was a man carved from Siberian granite, his face a roadmap of old campaigns, his eyes carrying the cold weight of absolute authority. He moved not like a man, but like an institution, his presence sucking the very air from the room. He didn't look at Rostova. He stared at the holoscreen, at the elegant, terrifying white line. "Report," Volkov commanded, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Rostova repeated his findings, his words sharp and clear, laying out the impossible facts one by one. He presented the sensor data, the velocity calculations, the satellite imagery. When he finished, Volkov remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the image. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes, not shock, not fear, but something harder, more dangerous. Annoyance. "This incident," Volkov finally said, turning his gaze on Rostova, "is a fiction. A confluence of sensor malfunctions and enemy disinformation. It is a lie designed to sow doubt. Marshal, the evidence. The evidence is irrelevant. Volkov cut him off, the finality in his tone like a slammed vault door. The global Iron Dome is impenetrable. This is not a matter of debate. It is a strategic certainty upon which our entire national defense rests. To question it is to question the very foundation of this state. He paused, letting the threat hang in the chilled air. Therefore, this event did not happen. Rostova felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. This was no longer a strategic assessment. This was a declaration of dogma. Volkov's gaze swept across the faces of the assembled officers, daring any one of them to challenge him. None did. They were soldiers, but they were also politicians, survivors in a system that prized loyalty over truth. Then Volkov delivered the edict that would seal their fate. Effective immediately, a Tier 1 security directive is in place. This alleged sighting is reclassified as a high-atmosphere meteorological event. All logs, sensor data and reports pertaining to this incident are to be scrubbed. Any officer, technician or pilot, regardless of rank, who discusses or perpetuates this fantasy of a phantom aircraft will be subject to immediate court-martial for defeatism and the spreading of seditious rumors. Is that understood? It was a command born not of strength but of profound, terrifying weakness. Rostova felt the last of his arguments die in his throat. He looked around the room and saw not leaders but priests defending a hollow faith. They were nodding their faces, grimly accepting complicity, settling over them like a shroud. They were choosing the comforting lie over the devastating truth. Leaving the war room, the heavy doors closing behind him with a sound of utter finality, Rostova finally understood. It wasn't about the evidence. It was never about the evidence. The denial ran deeper than strategy. It was woven into the very soul of the hegemony. For 30 years they had built their identity on the myth of their technological supremacy. The global Iron Dome was more than a weapons system. It was a symbol of their genius, their power, their manifest destiny to rule. It was the steel embodiment of their national pride. That single contrail was a dagger pointed at the heart of that pride. To acknowledge it existed was to admit that their shield was brittle, their genius was matched, and their destiny was not guaranteed. And for men like Volkov, men whose entire lives, careers, and legacies were built upon that grand edifice, admitting such a thing was a form of suicide. They would rather sacrifice their nation's security than their own monumental arrogance. They had built themselves a beautiful, impenetrable cage of pride, and now that a monster was circling outside, their only response was to close their eyes and insist the cage was still safe. Rostova walked down the cold, sterile corridor, the silence of the bunker pressing in on him. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the real war was not going to be fought against the phantoms in the sky. It would be fought against the calcified minds of his own commanders, and it was a war they had already lost. While Marshal Volkov and the High Command wrapped themselves in a cocoon of denial, the truth of their predicament was being pieced together in a shielded subterranean laboratory far from the political theatre of the capital. This was the domain of Dr. Aris Thorne, the reclusive, brilliant mind who had architected the very quantum sensors the hegemony now claimed were malfunctioning. He was a man who trusted data, not dogma. Volkov's official memo reclassifying the incident as a meteorological event was sitting on his console, and he regarded it with the same contempt a physicist would a flat Earth treatise. He knew what he had seen. The ghost in his machine was real. For 72 agonizing hours, Thorne and his small, hand-picked team of analysts had been locked in a digital hunt, chasing the faint electronic echoes the phantom had left behind. They worked in a feverish silence, fueled by stimulants and a cold, professional terror. The data was fragmented, corrupted, almost ethereal, as if the aircraft itself was actively trying to erase its own existence from the electromagnetic spectrum. But it had made one mistake. For a microsecond, as it banked over Ethelberg, its energy shielding had fluctuated, and a burst of telemetry data no bigger than a grain of sand had bled through the noise. It was enough. "My God," Thorne whispered, leaning so close to the holographic display that his breath fogged the light. The telemetry was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was a symphony of impossible engineering, a blueprint for a weapon that belonged to the next century. The aircraft they had codenamed Spectre wasn't just an advancement, it was an entirely new species of predator. At its heart was the engine. The energy signature was not consistent with a conventional scramjet which would have burned out in the thin atmosphere, nor a rocket which would have left a massive thermal plume. The data suggested something far more revolutionary, a hybrid cycle scramjet. It was a theoretical holy grail of propulsion, a system that could breathe air like a jet at lower altitudes, and then by injecting an onboard oxidant transform into a closed-cycle rocket engine for trans-atmospheric flight. "It doesn't fly through the air," Thorne explained to his rapt team, his voice hushed with a terrible awe. "It uses the atmosphere as a springboard, then leaps into the void. It can transition between air-breathing and rocket modes seamlessly. We thought this was decades away. Decades." This engine allowed the Spectre to cruise at an operational ceiling of over 2,000,000 feet in altitude. The hegemony considered near space a dead zone, where their vaunted Su-75 Checkmate 2 interceptors couldn't even reach. The Su-75, their apex fighter, topped out at 8,000,000 feet before its engines starved for air and its control surfaces became useless. To send an Su-75 after the Spectre would be like asking a shark to hunt an eagle. They didn't even operate in the same ecosystem. Then there was the issue of its invisibility. It wasn't just stealthy, it was actively erasing itself from reality. The few radar returns they had managed to capture were distorted, chaotic. The aircraft's skin was not absorbing radar waves, it was manipulating them. Thorne's materials specialist, a young woman named Lena Petrova, projected a molecular model onto the main screen. "It's a metamaterial," she stated, her voice trembling slightly. "Not a passive coating, but an active, energy-fed surface. It's composed of trillions of nanoscale structures that can dynamically alter their electromagnetic properties. It doesn't just absorb radar. It bends, it redirects. It makes our waves flow around the fuselage like water around a stone. We aren't trying to detect an aircraft. We're trying to detect a localized distortion in space-time." This explained why their S-600 Triumph missile system, the most feared surface-to-air weapon on the planet capable of hitting a satellite in low orbit, had failed to even register a target. The S-600's guidance system relied on a stable radar signature to calculate an intercept. Trying to lock onto the Spectre was like trying to shoot a mirage with a rifle. The target simply wasn't there. But the most terrifying revelation came from the telemetry burst. It wasn't just propulsion and material data. It contained a fragmented line of code, an encrypted signal that seemed to be communicating not with a remote pilot but with itself. "It's an onboard AI," Thorne concluded, his face pale. "We're calling it Cerberus. Look at this sequence. Just before our primary radar net went active, the Spectre's energy signature spiked. The code suggests it was a preemptive electronic warfare attack. It didn't jam our systems, it anticipated them. The AI predicted the exact frequencies and waveforms we were going to use and broadcast a cancellation signal fractions of a second before we transmitted. It's like a chess player who knows your next 10 moves and has already checkmated you." The hegemony's entire defense philosophy was reactive. The dome was designed to detect a threat, track it, and destroy it. But the Spectre was always a step ahead. It was a proactive hunter. It didn't break through their shield. It simply rendered the shield irrelevant. Thorne pulled up a schematic of their own prized EW platform, the Aegis system. Aegis was a powerful, brutish jammer capable of blinding enemy electronics with overwhelming force, but it was a blunt instrument compared to the scalpel of Cerberus. Aegis was a sledgehammer. Cerberus was a neurosurgeon. In a secret report sent through a back channel directly to a trusted contact on the Strategic Council, Thorne laid out the horrifying conclusion. He used a stark analogy he knew the generals would understand. "Imagine our entire defensive network, the global Iron Dome, the S-600 batteries, the Su-75 squadrons, is the most advanced medieval castle ever built. It has the highest walls, the strongest gates, the most skilled archers. We have spent a generation perfecting the art of castle defense. Yesterday the enemy flew over our walls in a B-2 bomber and dropped a thermobaric weapon on the king's chambers. We are not facing a better sword. We are facing a firearm, and we have brought crossbows to the fight." The report was a plea for sanity, a desperate attempt to shatter the High Command's delusion. It explained in cold, hard detail that their multi-trillion-dollar investment in defense had been rendered obsolete overnight. Their top-tier fighters were grounded by altitude, their missiles were blinded by physics, and their command systems were outthought by a machine. The hegemony was no longer a fortress. It was a cage, and the door had just been kicked in by a predator from the future. Thorne sent the encrypted file, then leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screens illuminating his exhausted face. He had delivered the truth. Now he could only pray that someone was still brave enough to listen. "Doctor," Thorne's report, a desperate flare of truth shot into the void of the High Command's delusion, was met with a silence more damning than any rebuke. It was not read, it was buried. Marshal Volkov, insulated by layers of sycophantic generals, dismissed it as the hysterical ramblings of a civilian scientist, another voice of doubt in a chorus. He was determined to silence. The hegemony's leadership, having chosen their reality, proceeded as if the sky was still theirs. The next lesson would not be delivered in a secret memo. It would be written in fire and wreckage. For 6 days, an unnerving quiet settled over the nation. The phantom of Aethelberg became a whispered rumor, a ghost story told by radar technicians and quickly suppressed. Then on the 7th day, the ghosts returned. Not for a flyover, but for a kill. The target was the Kirov 7 communications relay, a massive satellite dish complex nestled deep within the supposedly impenetrable heartland of the hegemony. Kirov 7 was the central nervous system of their northern command, a fortress of technology bristling with its own dedicated S-600 battery and a squadron of Su-75 seconds on permanent alert status. It was considered one of the most secure facilities on the planet. At 0400 hours, under the cold light of the stars, it ceased to exist. There was no warning, no incoming missile alert, no screech of approaching aircraft. The first sign of trouble was when the entire northern military grid went dark. On-site surveillance feeds showed a single blinding flash of white light and then static. When reconnaissance drones finally reached the site hours later, they found only a crater of molten glass and twisted metal glowing with an unnatural heat. The S-600 battery was untouched but inert, its guidance systems fused into slag. The nearby airbase was a charnel house. The hangars containing the alert squadron had been systematically cored out from above their roofs, peeled back like tin cans. The weapon's signature was as impossible as the aircraft that delivered it. Analysis suggested a kinetic strike, a dense metal rod accelerated to hypersonic speeds from extreme altitude. It was a clean, surgical, and utterly unstoppable attack. This was not a meteorological event. This was a declaration of war from an enemy who treated their most formidable defenses as irrelevant scenery. The denial in the high command shattered. Panic, cold, and sharp took its place. The order was finally given, born of terror and fury, hunt and destroy. This was the moment Major Kalen Viper Radek had been waiting for. He was the hegemony's premier ace, a man with 20 confirmed kills, a predator who saw the cockpit of his Su-75 Checkmate 2, not as a machine but as an extension of his own body. The rumors of a ghost ship were an insult to him, and to every pilot in the Air Corps. They were the hunters, the wolves of the sky. He would not stand by while some phantom defiled their territory. Briefing was tense. Intelligence was a mess of contradictions and speculation. "We have no confirmed visual, no reliable signature," the intel officer admitted, his face grim. "Your target is a ghost. We will vector you to the last known energy fluctuation. From there, you're on your own. Command priority is one thing: reclaim our sky." Strapped into his cockpit, Radek felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the cold focus that had made him a legend. He and his squadron, the elite stalkers, were the tip of the spear. As his engine roared to life, he felt a supreme confidence. Whatever was up there, it was made of metal and wires, and anything made of metal and wires could be broken. They climbed in a perfect aggressive formation, punching through the clouds into the thin, dark blue of the upper atmosphere. 8,000,000 feet. The Su-75 seconds strained at the edge of their performance envelope, their engines gasping in the oxygen-starved air. Below them, the world was a gentle curve. Above there was only the blackness of the void. The sky was utterly, completely empty. Stalker lead to all units, spread formation, scan all sectors. Eyes sharp, Radek's voice was calm, authoritative. Stalker 2, nothing on scopes. clean as a whistle. Stalker 3, negative contact. They patrolled the silent, empty ceiling of the world for 10 minutes that stretched into an eternity. The initial confidence began to curdle into a tense unease. How do you hunt something that isn't there? The fuel gauges ticked down. The mission was beginning to feel like a fool's errand, a high-altitude parade to appease the panicked generals on the ground. And then it happened. Without a sound, without a flash on the radar, Stalker 4, flying on Radek's far right, simply vanished. One moment, the navigation light was a steady green dot in his peripheral vision. The next, there was a silent, blossoming flower of orange and black debris where his wingman had been. Viper, what was that? Where did it come from? Stalker 2 screamed over the comms. Contact. Where is it? I have nothing. Radek's blood turned to ice. His threat display was black. His radar was clear. His AI tactical suite was silent. Yet his wingman was dead. They were being shot at by the sky itself. A proximity alert shrieked in his ear, a split second too late. He instinctively slammed his stick to the left, his fighter groaning under the brutal G-force. A sliver of incandescent light, impossibly fast, shot past his canopy, so close he felt the heat of its passage. It wasn't a missile. It was a solid projectile, a silver needle of death. He looked up, and he saw it. For a fraction of a second, silhouetted against the blackness of space was a shape. It was long, impossibly flat, and had no discernible wings or engines. It wasn't flying. It was hovering, a predator suspended in the void far above him, looking down on them like specimens in a petri dish. Then it was gone. Break, break, dive. All units dive now, Radek yelled, his voice cracking with a terror he had never known. He pushed his fighter into a desperate, bone-jarring descent, fleeing the empty sky. Another silent explosion rocked the formation. Stalker 3 was gone. The comms were a chaos of panicked screams and static. Radek was no longer a hunter. He was prey. He was a ground animal fleeing a hawk, his only defense to plunge back into the safety of the thick air below. He didn't look back. He knew there was nothing to see. The Spectres were gods in the void, and his squadron had been nothing more than a momentary distraction. He landed his Su-75 with trembling hands, the only survivor. As he walked across the tarmac past the grim-faced ground crews and the empty hangar that belonged to his squadron, the full, soul-crushing reality of their situation crashed down upon him. The confidence, the pride, the lifetime of belief in his own and his nation's superiority, it had all been incinerated in the cold, empty space above. That night, in a secured personal log, Major Kalen Radek, the hegemony's greatest ace, wrote the epitaph for their Air Force. Entry 448. We were sent to hunt gods today. We flew to the roof of the world, proud and arrogant, believing we were its masters. We were wrong. The sky is no longer ours. It is a ceiling, and it is haunted. We are not the hunters anymore. We are the ones who are hunted not by an enemy we can fight, but by an absence, a silence that kills from the darkness above. I saw it. I don't know what it was, but I know this: we are no longer soldiers. We are targets. The massacre of the Stalker Squadron was not an act of war. It was a demonstration. The loss of Major Radek's wingmen was a brutal, calculated message sent from the heavens. The hegemony's sky was no longer a sovereign territory, but a hunting ground. The psychological shockwave ripped through the air corps with devastating speed. The swagger and pride that had defined their pilots evaporated, replaced by a cold, gnawing fear of the empty space above. Radek's chilling debrief, classified at the highest levels, became a whispered legend, the story of the ace who had looked into the eyes of a god and fled. Flights were scrubbed. Pilots reported sudden, inexplicable mechanical failures. The tip of the hegemony's spear had been blunted against an enemy it could not see, touch, or fight. And it was then, with their aerial hunters cowed and effectively grounded, that the true strategic assault began. The Spectres were not merely fighters. They were the scalpels of a devastating campaign of industrial surgery, and they now began to dissect the hegemony's war machine with terrifying precision. The enemy's strategy became brutally clear. They were not interested in dogfights or tactical victories. They were dismantling the entire infrastructure that allowed the hegemony to project power. The first domino to fall was fuel. The hegemony's military ran on highly refined cryomethane, produced at 3 colossal, heavily fortified refineries located deep in the mountainous interior. These facilities, codenamed Vulcan 1, 2, and 3, were the heart of the war machine, pumping the lifeblood that fueled their tanks, ships, and aircraft. They were protected by overlapping layers of the Iron Dome, considered so secure that they were the designated fallback command centers in the event of an invasion. In the space of a single night, all three were struck. The attacks were identical to the one at Kirov, 7 silent, instantaneous, and utterly catastrophic. Kinetic rods, mere slivers of tungsten travelling at unimaginable speeds, lanced down from the void. They didn't explode. They simply imparted so much kinetic energy that the massive cryo-storage tanks vaporized on impact. The resulting fireballs were visible from orbit, turning the night sky over the remote mountain ranges a hellish, pulsating orange. Within hours, 80% of the hegemony's strategic fuel production was gone. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The order came down from a frantic high command. All non-essential flights were grounded indefinitely. This included training missions. New pilots, fresh from the academy, were now stranded on the ground, unable to log the flight hours necessary to become combat-ready. The pipeline of new talent that had kept the Air Corps vital was severed. Worse, the veteran pilots were now rationed to a handful of sorties a month. Their skills, honed by years of constant practice, began to atrophy. The wolves of the sky were being declawed and caged, not by the enemy but by their own empty fuel tanks. The second domino was production. The Spectres, having blinded and starved the military, now began to break its bones. The target was the Uralograd Industrial Complex, a sprawling city of factories that produced everything from the Su-75's advanced engines to the guidance systems for the S-600 missiles. For decades, Uralograd had been the invincible arsenal of the hegemony, a testament to its industrial might. The Spectres did not level the city. Their approach was far more insidious. They used their unparalleled surveillance capabilities to identify and target only the most critical choke points in the production line. A kinetic rod would shear through the roof of a single unassuming building, destroying the precision forge that manufactured the Su-75's turbine blades. Another would obliterate the clean room where the S-600's quantum gyroscopes were assembled. They weren't bombing factories, they were performing industrial decapitations. The assembly lines ground to a halt. 1,000 interconnected processes failed because one critical component was suddenly unavailable. Production quotas weren't just missed, they plummeted to near zero. The hegemony could no longer build new interceptors to replace their losses, nor could they manufacture the missiles to rearm their now useless defense batteries. The war machine was not only running out of fuel to move, it was running out of parts to repair itself. The final domino was command and control. With the military's ability to fight back crippled, the Spectres began a terrifying campaign of psychological warfare. They were no longer invisible phantoms. They began to allow themselves to be seen. A Spectre would descend to a lower, though still unreachable altitude, and pace a major highway in broad daylight. A silent, dark sliver against the blue sky, letting thousands of civilians see the impossible truth with their own eyes. It would hover motionless over a major city for an hour, a silent sentinel of their government's impotence before accelerating into the heavens in a blink. The myth of the invincible hegemony, the core of the state's propaganda, was being systematically dismantled in front of the very people it was meant to control. This culminated in the ultimate act of psychological dominance. As Marshal Volkov was delivering a blistering, defiant speech on national television, promising to sweep the skies clean of these cowardly phantoms, a Spectre flew directly over the capital's central broadcast tower. It didn't fire a shot. Instead, its Cerberus AI hijacked the broadcast signal. For 30 seconds, Volkov's enraged face was replaced with a live, crystal-clear, downward-facing camera view from the Spectre itself. The nation watched in stunned silence as they looked down upon their own capital from an impossible height, the world a perfect conquered map below. The signal then cut out, returning to a sputtering, speechless Volkov. The effect was a death blow to national morale. The government could no longer deny the truth. The enemy had shown it to them. The hegemony wasn't just losing a war, it was being humiliated on a global stage, its power revealed as a hollow shell. The entire system, built on a foundation of fear and perceived strength, began to crumble from within. Food riots broke out in secondary cities as the crippled transportation network failed. Regional governors began to quietly ignore directives from the capital. The military, paralyzed by fuel shortages, unable to replace its equipment, and led by a discredited high command, could do nothing to stop the decay. The hegemony was not being defeated in a blaze of glorious combat. It was being starved, dissected, and demoralized into submission. The Spectres had achieved a strategic victory without fighting a single major battle. They had proven that the most powerful army in the world is useless if it cannot be fueled, armed, or commanded. They had turned the hegemony's greatest strength, its centralized monolithic power structure, into its greatest vulnerability, and they were now pulling it apart thread by thread from the cold, silent darkness of the stratosphere. The end for the hegemony did not come with a climactic battle or a triumphant invasion. It came with a quiet, ignominious broadcast from a hidden bunker. Marshal Volkov, his face gaunt, and his uniform hanging loosely on his shrunken frame, announced an unconditional ceasefire. The war was over. The great and terrible hegemony, the empire that had cast its shadow across a continent, had been brought to its knees without a single enemy soldier setting foot on its soil. The cogs of its mighty war machine had not been shattered in combat. They had simply rusted in place, starved of fuel parts and purpose. The Spectres had won not by destroying an army, but by rendering the very concept of that army obsolete. Years later, at a war tribunal convened by the newly formed Global Council, the truth was finally given a voice. Stripped of his rank and authority, the man who was once Volkov sat before his interrogators, a ghost haunted by the phantoms he had once denied. When asked to identify the precise moment he knew the war was lost, he didn't speak of the destroyed refineries or the paralyzed factories. His gaze grew distant, looking past the walls of the courtroom, and into a memory of profound humiliation. It was the broadcast, he admitted, his voice, a dry rasp. When I saw my own capital from the eyes of their machine looking down on us as a man might look down on an anthill. In that moment I understood. They were not just attacking our military, they were attacking our reality. They had seized the ultimate high ground, a place from which they could dictate the terms of our existence. We had built walls to protect our land, but they owned the sky above it. Everything after that was merely the playing out of a foregone conclusion. His testimony was echoed by Major Kylan Radek, the once great ace whose own words carried the weight of a survivor. We trained to fight other planes, Radek stated, his voice steady but devoid of its former arrogance. We were masters of a game that our enemy refused to play. They didn't engage us. They simply removed the board. Fighting the Spectre was not combat as we understood it. It was an extinction event. We were dinosaurs gazing up at the asteroid. The post-war analysis conducted by military historians and strategists from around the world painted the picture in stark, undeniable numbers. The statistics revealed a campaign of almost unbelievable efficiency, a new paradigm of warfare. Aircraft losses. The hegemony lost 178 of its elite Su-75 Checkmate 2 interceptors. Of these, only 2 were lost in anything resembling combat. The other 176 were destroyed on the ground in hangars on runways or in factories by precision kinetic strikes. In contrast, the number of confirmed Spectre losses was 0. Not a single hostile aircraft was successfully tracked, engaged, or destroyed throughout the entire conflict. The kill ratio was for all practical purposes infinite. Industrial paralysis. In a campaign lasting just 90 days, 27 critical infrastructure nodes were destroyed. These strikes, executed with surgical precision, resulted in a 95% reduction in aviation fuel production, an 88% reduction in advanced munitions manufacturing, and a 70% collapse in the national power grid. The hegemony's industrial output was effectively reset to a pre-digital age level in a matter of weeks. Strategic revolution. The Spectre had introduced a new, terrifying metric to warfare: strategic altitude dominance. For a century, military doctrine had revolved around controlling the air up to 1,000,000 feet. The Spectre operated in the largely ignored transatmospheric layer from 15,000 to 30,000 feet. By controlling this near-space domain, it could strike any target on the planet with impunity, bypassing every known air defense system. It rendered billions of dollars of investment in traditional anti-aircraft and fighter technology utterly worthless. The legacy of the Spectre was not just the collapse of the hegemony, but the complete and violent upheaval of global military doctrine. The age of the dogfight, the tank battle, and the carrier group was over. The world's superpowers, watching in a mixture of terror and awe, frantically scrapped their old plans. A new arms race had begun overnight, a desperate scramble to develop trans-atmospheric capabilities. The focus shifted from building better fighters to building faster, higher-flying platforms that could challenge the new gods of the stratosphere. Defense budgets were rewritten, research divisions were retasked. The world's brightest minds were thrown into the singular challenge of conquering that silent black void at the edge of space. Military academies worldwide still study the Spectre doctrine as the textbook example of a true revolution in military affairs. The lessons were brutal and timeless one. The ultimate high ground is altitude. The power that controls the space above the atmosphere controls the planet beneath it. 2. Infrastructure is the new front line. Why destroy an army when you can simply turn off its supply chain? Modern warfare is a battle of logistics, and the Spectre proved to be the ultimate logistical disruptor. 3. Proactive defense is obsolete reactive systems, no matter how fast or powerful, are doomed to fail against an enemy that can anticipate and neutralize them before they can even act. 4. Psychological dominance is the final weapon. The Spectre's greatest victory was not over the hegemony's military, but over its will to fight. By shattering the myth of invincibility, it broke the spirit of a nation. The image of that lone, silent aircraft hovering over Aethelberg became one of the defining symbols of the 21st century. It was a testament to the terrifying power of technological surprise, a stark reminder that the assumptions of today can become the ruins of tomorrow. The Spectre didn't just win a war, it redrew the map of power and forever changed the definition of the sky. It proved that the future of conflict would not be won by the largest army, but by the side that could see, think, and strike from a place its enemies could not even begin to comprehend. In the end, the story of the hegemony's fall became less a tale of military conquest and more a cautionary fable about the perilous nature of pride. The XR-9 Spectre, in its silent, untouchable majesty, was not merely a superior weapon, it was an agent of truth. It held up a mirror to a regime built on the illusion of its own perfection and forced it to look at its own reflection, revealing the brittle foundation beneath the marble facade. The war was lost not when the first kinetic rod fell, but in the sterile confines of the war room, when Marshal Volkov and his council chose the comfort of a lie over the brutal, liberating clarity of the truth. Their true enemy was not the phantom in the sky, but the dogma in their own minds. The Spectre's legacy is etched not in the craters it left behind, but in the complete reorientation of global power. The world it created is one of nervous glances upward of a sky that is no longer a mere expanse of blue, but a strategic chessboard of terrifying dimensions. The great powers of today no longer measure their strength in carrier groups or armored divisions alone. The true metric of power is now measured in altitude velocity and the silent predictive power of artificial intelligence. The race for the heavens, once a peaceful endeavor of scientific exploration, has become a frantic, militarized scramble for the ultimate high ground. Every satellite launched, every hypersonic test conducted is an echo of that first impossible contrail drawn over Aethelberg. The pilots who survived men like Kalen Radek became a lost generation. They were warriors trained for a form of combat that had become extinct overnight, their skills as obsolete as those of a cavalryman facing a machine gun. They lived in the shadow of a war they could never truly comprehend, haunted by a foe they could never fight. Their experiences serve as a permanent reminder that courage and skill, no matter how profound, are ultimately rendered meaningless when faced with a revolutionary shift in the very nature of conflict. Ultimately, the Spectre did more than just defeat a nation. It shattered a global paradigm. It proved that the future of warfare would not be a contest of attrition, but a battle of information, speed, and strategic vision. It demonstrated that the most decisive blow is not the one that destroys an army, but the one that dismantles an opponent's ability to function, to believe, and to resist. The silent predator that haunted the stratosphere forced humanity to lift its gaze to understand that the frontiers of conflict were no longer limited to land, sea, or air, but extended into the cold, unforgiving vacuum at the edge of the world. The shock of its arrival has never truly faded. It simply became the new, unsettling reality under which all nations must now live.